Morning, everybody. I acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri First Nations people, and I pay my respects to their heritage, beliefs, and living culture. The accent will not change in the course of this delivery. Expectum pachyderm. That's my Harry Potter spell to kick off the session, to reveal the elephants in the room. The observant among you will see them materialize over the next half hour or so. They'll sometimes appear at random. Do not be alarmed. Recognizing the presence of the elephants in the room is the first step towards dealing with their existence. It also sets the tone for what's about to follow. And I do acknowledge the irony of me delivering a lecture about the future of higher education when the lectures days are probably numbered in that future. Now, please note that the phrase training students for jobs that do not yet exist using tools that have not yet been invented will not be making a second appearance during this narrative. That isn't the future of higher education that we need to contemplate today. I would like to thank the organisers, though, for inviting me to deliver this address this morning, and I'd like to thank my colleagues back in South Australia for engineering matters so that we aren't in the middle of a university merger, which gives me enough time to actually deliver the address. As an aside, and with some relevance to the future of higher education, for undoubtedly we do face a future where amalgamations must still be countenanced, not least because now, as we saw from the data, more than 1 in 8 of Australia's universities ran a deficit last year. Having said that, I do also want to make sure that I don't suggest that mergers are appropriate mechanisms to deal with digging your way out of a financial hole. But they're certainly mechanisms that enable the contemplation of radical readjustment of the status quo of your business, and they have value as thought exercises in that domain alone. For those of you who would like the inside track, the UniSA Adelaide merger didn't happen for a lot of reasons. All of them were significant, and absolutely none of them were linked to ego or position jockeying. Don't believe everything you read in the papers. The take-home lesson is that university mergers are very expensive. They're very complicated undertakings, and if you're not going to get them absolutely right and fully geared for the benefit of everybody concerned, taking into account your community, cultural and collateral manners, you just shouldn't attempt them. I'm very pleased that we did take a very long, hard, objective look at the prospect, and that included the analysis of a business case and additional inputs such as external branding and ranking agency reports and hundreds of public submissions. And all of that data and the associated cost projections and the models, the risk profile that came from those key assumptions, and the status of considerations such as the timeline for delivery, transition arrangements, the proposals related to governance, the engagement with TEXA on what we might have to do afterwards, the leadership, the mission, the values of any merged institution. They were all examined, and they were looked through the lens of cost-benefit at an institutional, state and national level. And through that analysis, weighed against the risks, our council decided that there was no compelling case to support a merger of the two universities. Now, ultimately, as a case study and within the context of contemplating alternative higher education futures, I'd suggest that this is exactly what governing bodies are there for, to make informed, evidence-based decisions which have a bearing on the future of the organisation. It's regulation in action. And not everybody likes being regulated or likes the decisions that come from regulation, but not every decision needs to be liked or subsequently explained in fine detail. And that may create unfounded and, quite frankly, some very lazy speculation in the press. But it's not the job of a governing body to represent or represent the detailed business case for redebate or public interrogation. A job of work was undertaken, and those charged with doing the job delivered an outcome. And two strong universities continue on independently. Now, as an aside, the state of South Australia has 2 of the nation's top 10 universities in it, according to Times Higher Education's World University Rankings. UniSA is at number 10, and Adelaide's at number 8. Had a merger been enacted, after expending a very significant amount of money to achieve the outcome, it would only have 1, and it would still be number 8. And that's all I want to say about that particular number. I will return to the possibilities of the new later in my talk. It did cross my mind, actually, fleetingly, that given that the current government has decided that it could do away not only with the demand-driven system for funding participation, but also the participation targets themselves, which originated in the Bradley Review. And I very deliberately note here that South Australian higher education participation rates sit at 31%. That's 22.5% below the Bradley targets, in a state where ABS data shows that school leaver numbers are going to grow by 10% in the next 5 years, and where those same school leavers will find themselves in an unfunded capped higher education system, seeking places within institutions that risk financial viability should they enroll these students while capped at their 2017 income levels, and against the backdrop we saw of risk on the finance spectrum here. At the same time, they're charged by compact with enabling participation and producing a future skilled workforce, ironically a workforce which is skewed towards science and technology, the very funding cluster which is worst affected by the cap. What crossed my mind against that backdrop was that given the participation targets and the mechanism to fund these targets has been jettisoned, that they, the current government, might similarly form the view that regulation has also run its course and it too could be done away with. And as TEXA too originated from Denise's bold examination of the national landscape back in 2008, this might be the last conference of its kind. But Deb's new hashtag with 2019 in it seems to say that it will not be the last opening keynote and you won't just go out on a high. Given that TEXA has been given a new bucket full of money, albeit from the same single higher education budgetary envelope, so more accurately we've robbed Peter to pay Paul again, standing here I doubt that regulation will disappear into the sunset. Now joking aside, there's a lot to be said for appropriate regulation in our sector. And more on that later. But from a TEXA standpoint, it's very good to be flavour of the month. And if you can manage to be regional as well, so much the better. Speaking of flavours of the month, I do remember we used to have a higher education infrastructure fund. It turned out that we also had all those institutions that aren't yet in deficit and anecdotally have huge surpluses, tracking at 4% of a margin. So what we knew as the HEIF was repurposed to pay for the NDIS, which in turn has been repurposed to pay for the drought relief, which has a specific envelope of scholarships for higher education participation in STEM subjects, which ironically is the aforementioned educational funding cluster of doom, because that scheme for participation expansion sits within the same 2017 capped funding levels. And so by design, and without any consideration of impact, we cycle very neatly around to creating a position of further future deficit. Now, I'm a chemist, I'm not an economist, but I do recognize an inverted Ponzi scheme when I see one. Certainly, this is not the foundation of good higher education policy for the future. So what should we be thinking about? Now, I'm pretty much established through my rate of pace of delivery and the language that I use and the fact that I can't pronounce TH, that I'm not originally from here. And while I do have my Aussie passport, it turns out that I'm still foreign enough to experience casual racism in my adopted country, and reciprocally foreign enough to also criticise with relative impunity. I spent the last 6 years in South Australia as the Vice-Chancellor of UniSA, but I'm originally from Dublin, the one in Ireland. And in Ireland, back in 1854, some 262 years after Queen Elizabeth I founded Trinity College Dublin, and around 20 years before the foundation of Adelaide University, a new higher education institution, University College Dublin, was founded by John Henry Newman, a Roman Catholic cardinal. Now, Cardinal Newman was a very unusual Roman Catholic insofar he started off as an evangelical Calvinist, and then he went on to become a priest in the Church of England, and then he became an Anglican priest before he finally settled down and signed up for the Catholic priesthood. He was canonized as a saint by the Pope in 2010. Now, there's a metaphor in there somehow about switching teams and achieving greatness, but I haven't thought it through sufficiently enough to make it truly funny in this context. Newman is relevant to our conversation today because as a philosopher and educationalist, and by that combination, he was a futurist. And in pre-regulation days, the best way to advance regularity, both physical and philosophical, was through prescription. And then in the manner of academics since time immemorial, Henry sat down and wrote a book. His book was called The Idea of a University, and it was a rule book, so to speak. The philosophy of that book has shaped nearly all modern universities that we know today. You could also argue it has actually shaped higher education in the round, all around. So for this purpose, and for the remainder of my talk, I will alternate between the use of the word university and higher education as I work through my treatise. Now, before that gets anybody in the room too upset, I do know that there is more to higher education than universities. I personally believe that we actually haven't worked hard enough to maximise the connectivity between differing forms of higher education. It's probably a gift of federation that Australian higher education is as fragmented as it currently is. I could go further and say that we probably need to consider how we defragment higher, secondary, primary and lifelong learning and really get to grips with K through life, But that would take us on a very different journey this morning with even more elephants. So briefly, I'll return to the topic of mergers for a moment and suggest that if we were thinking about connectivity in higher education in Australia, we could take a leaf out of the French book. The IDEX project in France is amalgamating institutions across qualification levels to systematically improve not only their financial stability, but their sustainability and the educational outcomes and the quality of French higher education. This approach is leading to new entrants in the world university ranking systems already, and in higher education ranking evaluations in general. But importantly, it's a targeted strategy to invest in France's national competitiveness through education, to enhance human capital and back it with additional money, so as to improve the system and take it beyond world class. It's not the application of cuts to stymie it and take it backwards. And while UniSA and Adelaide have decided not to continue our merry dance, we may well have lit a slow-burning fuse for the wider sector, one that could be fanned by evidence from international efforts. Now, on the topic of investing in national higher education for the national interest, as opposed to introducing a national interest test as an excuse to provide less funding, that was an elephant. I do remember back in the dark old days, almost 10 years ago, when Ireland had fallen off a financial cliff. The government of the day surprised everybody by putting up a €359 million research fund, that's 560 million Australian dollars in today's money, at a time of national bankruptcy. Now, why did they do this? To underpin the creation of a smart economy. The Prime Minister got to answer a wonderfully anti-intellectual press query about the value of the investment in higher education to underpin delivery of a smart economy by asking the journalist if they would prefer a dumb one. The heart of that investment was around driving quality interdisciplinary collaboration across institutions at all levels, not rewarding competitive individualism. It was about smart leverage. If you fast forward 10 years, the Irish economy has rebounded from catastrophe. It leads globally in the export of software and finished pharmaceuticals, and it now houses the European headquarters of the likes of Google, and Facebook, and LinkedIn, among many more. And this has nothing to do with corporate tax rates. Those incentives disappeared in the GFC. Tax-wise, it is cheaper to have your domicile company in Switzerland than it is to have it in Dublin. It's everything to do with thoughtful education policy and purposeful investment in higher education. And the Canadians have just done something similar, at scale. The alternative to investment is the creation of a dumb economy. And I have to ask, is that what we are chasing here in Australia? Some other international signposts for the future of higher education, setting aside Brexit as a flight of fancy. If you look to the UK, the Universities and Colleges Admission Service, UCAS, is a one-stop shop for admissions across the entire sector, all levels, all qualifications. It makes life much easier for the student. It makes the sector think about interconnectedness and pathways and articulation and cooperation and outcomes. I digress. Back to Cardinal Newman's regulatory rulebook. In it, the good Cardinal argued that the role of a university, and he was talking about universities at this stage, was to educate the intellect to reason well in all matters, to reach out for and to grasp the truth. Now that is a very simple premise, but it was very controversial in its day. He was saying we should teach students how to think and how to recognize truth. It's a very sound objective in today's false news era. One critic said of Newman's University, "The young men are allowed to go out at all hours and to smoke, and there has not been any fixed time for study." Now, setting aside the woeful lack of diversity and tobacco-related health consequences, imagine that. No timetabling. The education administrator's dream. If you fast forward 150 years or so, and we're all working very hard to introduce the concept of flexibility into our establishments, to teach our students how to think and to reason, to seek out truth in their education, to overcome ignorance, to overcome timetables, and to excel. Set against the backdrop of possible mergers, imposed or voluntary, the idea of a higher education system for the future is, I believe, worth contemplating now more than ever. That idea of higher education for the future need not depend on mergers or acquisitions for its realisation. It could, but it need not. Any of our institutions could reposition themselves with appropriate motivation. Now, what motivation would that be? Well, I shall contain my principal comment for the next little while, again, to the sector I understand best, universities. Now, that is to say, universities in the extent of our current understanding. I'm not going to touch on the mythical oxymoronic unicorn of the teaching-only university. That's another elephant. I do note, though, that the conversation has been writing about the advent of this particular unicorn for nearly 5 years now. But what we've seen in that time is the advent and enhancement of teaching-focused staffing policies. These are not the same thing, but they're not a bad thing. The university of the future has to continue to advance both teaching and research. And right now, while information is everywhere, knowledge is not. An institution for the future has to advance knowledge through research. And that would be research which is not constrained by a ministerial diktat of populist pub-testing national interest. Ideally, it's research which is aligned to use. The University of the Future should be conducting world-class research, peer-reviewed, not ministerially vetoed. Putting public money into research is an investment in the smart economy, but the buyer has to beware. Our post-Royal Commission financial institutions will now vocally caution us that the value of an investment can go down as well as up. And that's very well understood across the financial sector and the economic circles. So why would an investment in university research be any different? This is exactly where higher risk research happens, in higher education. It then gets translated out to industry. We should be supporting great research and balancing both curiosity and use, because breakthroughs happen at the interfaces between disciplines as fundamental discoveries are adapted for use. The institution of the future has to work harder to transfer that knowledge, not only through the education of our students, but also into wider society. We do that through partnership, through informing policy, through public discourse, and by leading by example. Higher education for the future has to provide the same ideal of Newman's flexibility. We have to move towards the provision of education on demand. We have to afford the same regulatory rigour to online provision as we do in the classroom. And we have to ensure that quality control is inculcated in all provision modalities towards tailored education on demand, which is decoupled from the confines of strict disciplinary shackles. We want to provide a future education which isn't only linked to bounded degree parchments or stuck inside blockchain buzzwords that relate to tiny credits, but rather one that's linked to validated competencies of the successful learner and measured in smaller units of learning outcome than the program or even the course. I do think that if we put our mind to it, this is something that we can usefully regulate for the entire sector. The higher education sector of the future therefore needs the AQF review to land the right way, to grapple with and to consider alternate future realities of learning and learning outcomes. I feel that we have to move towards an education future where the assumed truths of information are constantly challenged, such as the assumed truth that a standardized Year 12 examination is in some way a predictor of future academic potential or achievement. That's another elephant. On that topic, a future where transparency of admission criteria is championed, not grudgingly accepted, and where we recognize that inputs are not the same or directly correlated to outcomes when it comes to academic achievement through tertiary education. I would like to imagine a future where informed debate facilitates meaningful freedom of speech, and where freedom of inquiry is not free license to opine or to champion anecdote. Rather, it's an innate driver for the discovery of truth and fact. I'd like to imagine a future where it's actually okay to publicly sacrifice sacred cows, but to do it within the accepted confines of respect and measured, evidence-based factual argument. A future where we don't need a ministerially derived external inquiry to redetermine that the fundamental tenets of academic inquiry are quite obviously alive and well and in daily practice in all of our institutions. We have to adapt and adopt new ways to admit and to assess in higher education for the future. We have to move towards a system where the future is a forge where new knowledge is being created from many inputs in partnership and with others beyond our institutions. The idea that ours is the only input of value is archaic arrogance. Above all else, we have to move to a future where we can demonstrate relevance and we can provide value to the wider society so that no one ever has reason to question the future role of higher education in modern Australia. Now, these days, in higher education in modern Australia, vocational education often gets a bad rap. It gets looked down on, positioned as somehow lesser. I learned a sobering lesson firsthand in recent months that it matters not what your ERA scores say, what your NHMRC ranking says, what your QS World Subject rankings are, what your graduate employment satisfaction surveys say. If you've come from an Institute of Technology background or a College of Advanced Education background, you're institutionally at risk of being pigeonholed and being somehow lesser in the eyes of the establishment. Good at teaching, as if that's a bad thing, I think is very short-sighted. There's a blacksmith's forge in the very center of Stanford University in California. The engineering department was built around it on the framework of explicit vocational education. In 1891, Leland Stanford wanted his students, all the children of California, to have a practical education with utility and relevance and excellence and access all provided in equal measure. A higher education system for the future could do much worse than aspire to revisiting these goals. Equity of access for the realization of potential, excellence in all facets of operation, relevance in all facets of operation. There's no need to be elite. You just need to be principled and adhere to excellence. There's no need to be exclusive. Just be principled and adhere to excellence. You don't need to be aloof, entitled, or enigmatic. You can call a spade and show the relevance of higher education to society as we do in all our cases. Some of our educational content is intended to teach us how to think. Some of it is intended as the application of the learned thought process. The higher education system of the future should scaffold education and add value beyond the discipline or subject area. Now, I would like to be very clear about a point. I view programs as products. I do not view students as products. Courses are products. Modules are products. Higher education for the future should be manufacturing great products. Products that people want and people actually need. Products that are accredited first by the institution and then by the professional body. I do not believe we can allow the tail of professional accreditation to wag the education dog. And that's another elephant. So how many layers of accrediting are too many for so-called autonomous institutions within an already robust national external regulatory framework? Higher education in the future should be both responsive and responsible because it helps shape a tolerant multicultural society. It shines a light onto the darkness of ignorance. It won't hide behind an intellectual shield because it's supposed to use fact and truth and reason and evidence to educate. But most importantly, higher education in the future shouldn't have any ivory towers, physical or metaphorical. It and its content and its utility should be truly accessible, and they should be supported by our government to ever be so, not just locally, but nationally and globally, to all and for all. Education should exist for all, manifest through for-benefit organisations. Now, I've cast my spell, and it is time-bound. We've reached the last apparated elephant, which is autonomy in the realm of regulation. Is peaceful coexistence possible? Well, we've got HESA and TEXA and HESP and AQF and ERA and impact and engagement statements, transparent admissions, learned academies, QUILT, accrediting bodies who wish to set curriculum content, entry requirements, examination standards, international higher education ranking systems, as yet to be determined performance-based metrics for funding, enterprise agreements, academic workload models, and God help us all, emeritus professors. All with views on how things should be done. We face the ever-increasing call from employers for us to create job-ready graduates who require no further training to be fit for purpose for their industries, but also to function as entrepreneurs extraordinaire with sufficient social responsibility and moral reasoning to be compelling citizens of the future. So I ask, in such a highly regulated, monitored and evaluated system, how on earth are we ever going to innovate and leave room for individual excellence rather than conformity? How can we educate the intellect to reason well in all matters, to reach out for and grasp the truth? Are we doing a lousy job? I don't believe we are. We appear to have a world-class higher education system in this country. We just might want to think about how we enable it, not how we prescribe to it. Do we have to wait for a policy change or a funding crisis or a public opinion sea change before we set out to create the higher education system of the future? No. The foundations for the future are in all of our institutions already. The leaders here in this forum have to take on the responsibility to realise the full potential of our organisations, to eat the elephants one bite at a time, not in the future, but now, and deliver a higher education system for the future today. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That was a speech that I think was something more like a bestiary of higher education. We had unicorns.
We did.
We had sacred cows. We had things being pigeonholed. And then we had the elephants. And the elephants, of course, contribute to the ivory tower, as they do. But what was really compelling about the talk, and I think it was your accent that did this for me, is you asked us if we were up to the task. And if we could move from the elephants to demonstrating a side species, to be true, to demonstrating our relevance. You've got a career in this. I can see it now.
I don't think I said relevance.
Relevance.
It is a good pun.
It was a good pun. And there will be many more. If you don't like puns, it's time to go now. Questions from the floor. Signal to a microphone. There's a couple of questions coming in via event poll, so we might start with those. Our now PM referred to education as bad debt. Comment, please.
Look at the earning potential of a graduate and compare it to somebody who hasn't got a year 12's completion. It's not bad debt.
Do you believe more interconnectedness amongst universities and providers can together take the future of education to a disruptive realm?
Yeah, I do. I find that, again, the segmentation of the sector drives behaviours, whereas it's quite obvious that learners of the future will want to navigate their way and acquire, at the simplest level, credit and competence. And that competence comes at all levels within the framework. So I do think that between providers and universities, the ability to specialise and not replicate offerings. On many levels, we have a system which is geared where you've got a publicly funded institution competing in a market where there's a private provider who could provide something as the same quality for a lesser cost. So I do think some level of stratification and even some level of rationalisation would be useful for us.
Did I see a question up the back there? Yes, we have one from the floor.
Thanks for your talk. One of the things you didn't mention is the dependence of higher education in Australia on overseas student funding. So I don't know what animal that is, but do you see a future of interconnectedness internationally much more?
It might be an endangered species, that particular animal. I note that we are now a very expensive provider of higher education for international students. The motivations for students, if they are linked to acquisition of knowledge, can be served elsewhere. There are other markets on the global economy where students can access education. They do come to us because we have a world-class higher education system. They also acquire post-study work rights in many cases. I think one of the difficulties, certainly in the university sector, is that oftentimes it's the only space in which a university can recoup costs, operating within a fixed cap at a 2017 level in a fixed pie, which is indexed and short indexed at that, against, I suppose, enterprise bargaining arrangements which drive costs up year on year, means that there needs to be some accrual of potential revenue for investment, not only in research, but in the physical infrastructure of the institutions. So the system, the public purse squeeze of domestic education drives an appetite for international education. And that runs a big risk for, I think, the system itself, given its dependency on the markets. If you look at the overexposure to specific jurisdictions, the risk for what is a multi-billion-dollar industry is probably at its highest level now than it's ever been. So global connectedness is not going to change that. What it's going to do is shine a light on the fact that Australia is an expensive jurisdiction in which to acquire higher education if you're an international student.
We have one more question from Event Poll, and that will be it. This is a great one because it does involve animals. How do we get the balance between utility and relevance and not allowing professional accreditation bodies to wag the education dog?
So I did say I'm a chemist, and I view the prescription from accrediting bodies in terms of fitness to practice is fine, which is about the outcome from an institution, but fitness of content is a different thing. And as an autonomous self-accrediting institution leader, I think we should be able to determine the content in the classroom in collaboration and in consultation with accrediting bodies, but accreditation happening thereafter. Otherwise, I think what we get to is homeopathy. We get the infinite dilution of course content because as we produce something in one mould, it doesn't have any true appreciation of the breadth of disciplinarity which is within an institution and which can add value to the production of a well-rounded graduate, not just a widget to be inserted into an accreditation profession. We're not in the business of producing widgets. We want to produce people who can think, who are qualified, who can practice. And I think some stratification, again, about where the accreditation sits there for practice needs to be discussed at a national level because there's no headroom in curriculum right now for innovation.
Thank you very much to Professor David Lloyd.